Yeah, so we can get started. Yeah, and we can let Zoom folks in. It's fine.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy autumn. I used to like fall. Until I realized that winter comes after fall. Anyway, so I'm David Howell. I'm the acting director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations this year. I also teach Japanese history in the departments of East Asian languages and civilizations and history. And I've known our speaker today, Amy Borovoy, for at least 20 years. We won't inquire further than that, but we were colleagues together in the Department of East Asian Studies at Princeton and have remained pals ever since. So it's my great pleasure to be welcoming Professor Borovoy to our weekly seminar series at the Weatherhead Center's program on U.S.-Japan relations. And today's seminar is co-sponsored by the Edwin O. Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies here at Harvard. So Amy Borovoy is a professor of Japanese anthropology in the Department of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. She's a cultural and medical anthropologist whose research has examined how societies provide social care, public health, and mental health care. Her first book, The Too Good Wife, Alcohol, Codependence, and the Politics of Nurturance in Post-War Japan, University of California Press, 2005, is a study that looks at how women's work in containing the social harms of heavy drinking affects them and affects society more generally. It's not a happy book, but it's it's a depressing topic, but it's really insightful and opens up the world of alcohol dependence and codependence in Japanese society. She's also written on other topics of great interest to people following Japanese society, including the hikikomori phenomenon, eating disorders, and mass public health screening, special education, and mental health care, as well as COVID-19 containment, among other topics. She recently completed a book manuscript that looks at social science takes on Japanese society in search of social solidarity, the American study of modernity through post-war Japan, which examines how post-war U.S. social scientists came to terms with Japan's commitments to community, and society, in part to probe the limits of American liberalism and individualism. It sort of harkens back to the days when Japan was a big deal in the eyes of social scientists and historians throughout the world. It's still a big deal to us, but there was a kind of moment there. And so she's also published many journal articles, including the Journal of Asian Studies, Journal of Japanese Studies, Medical Anthropology, Social Science and Medicine, and the American Ethnologist. Her talk today is entitled Finding the Right Match, Kidney Donation and Transplantation as Family Welfare in Japan. As usual, we will ask Amy to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open things to Q&A. And also, as always, one of our fellows will have the honor and the privilege and the joy and the happiness without any nervousness asking the first question. Sorry, I made it worse. I'm sorry. First question is Masami Fujioka, who is an official in the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, MEDI, with a focus on healthcare policies. So he's a very apt person to be asking the question. He's working on a research project entitled Creating the Health Tech Startup Ecosystem, Policy Innovations for Entrepreneurship. And so we'll hear from Mr. Fujioka later after Amy's talk. So no further ado, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, David. It's wonderful to see you and to be back here at Harvard, to see so many colleagues I know and admire and have for many years, and also to have the chance to engage with others at the program in U.S.-Japan relations and to meet the fellows this year, whom I know I will learn a lot from discussing this topic. So I just want to jump right in because 30 minutes goes quickly, especially for long-winded academics. and say that I've become very interested in the question of end-stage renal disease and care for the kidneys as another lens for thinking about the problem of resource allocation, social welfare, and the distribution of social care in Japan. And as I think many of you know, when bodies age, which we all know is a problem in Japan, I was going to start my presentation with a population pyramid, but I decided that wasn't necessary. As bodies age, kidneys also age, and Japan has one of the highest utilization rates per capita of any country in the world, actually, after Taiwan, for dialysis treatment therapy for the kidneys. And it has the highest in the OECD. So end-stage renal disease, AKA kidney failure, is a major problem in Japan. And once kidneys fail, as you may know, there is no cure. There are only therapies which we can rely on to supplement or essentially replace the function of the kidneys. And there are two forms of therapy. Both are fairly radical, aggressive, invasive forms of biotechnological care. One is dialysis therapy, which essentially means, again, as some of you are familiar with, I'm sure Fujioka-san is especially, if you're someone who thinks about healthcare in Japan, a patient lies 3 times a week for somewhere between 3 to 5 hours, where an external circuit withdraws blood from the body. It's essentially a form of extracorporeal filtration where all the blood of the body is filtered through this dialyzer machine and through this membrane that you're seeing on the slide, through a kind of crystallized liquid called dialysate. The blood is purified and then pumped back into the body. Essentially, the machine is performing the function of the kidneys. And dialysis is an extremely draining therapy for those of you who know someone who's undergone dialysis therapy. It can be exhausting. It also demands a high level of self-discipline, and that you have to really care for yourself if you're on dialysis, restrict intake of certain minerals, fluids, etc. The other, I'm kind of moving quickly, but we can come back to any of these issues. I'm sort of packing in some context here. The other form of treatment for kidney failure is, of course, kidney transplantation. And here, you probably noticed that you're seeing 3 kidneys. Usually when a kidney from another body is transplanted into the body, it's transplanted into the front on the lower left because the sort of venal architecture is better there, and the older kidneys are not removed. Kidney transplantation, too, is a radical and in some ways kind of pioneering and also sort of socially experimental form of treatment where, of course, there are 2 forms of transplantation. One is deceased donation and one is living donation. Deceased donation means receiving a kidney from a donor body who's only recently deceased, usually as the result of an unexpected trauma, like a car accident, or in the United States, I believe the most rapidly growing category of deceased donors now are people who die of opioid addictions. So it is something that has involved a lot of ethical conversations in the United States, which I'll say a little bit more about, and elsewhere. And living donation, of course, in some ways is equally surprising in that it involves removing healthy tissue from a healthy living donor and transplanting it into someone else's body. Now, as many of you are probably familiar with, I'm going to show a lot of charts and graphs as I move along because the data is partly what roped me into thinking about this set of issues as I began to follow it through the Japan Society for Transplantation. And I also ended up sort of part of my little métier in following the set of issues is making lots of little pie charts and things to keep track of what's going on. This one I didn't make. But what you're seeing here basically is, in a sense, a kind of encapsulation of what's going on in Japan with respect to what's called renal replacement therapy. And that is that there are almost 350,000 people who are on dialysis therapy in Japan now, and a relatively small number on the left of people who are treating their end-stage renal disease with kidney transplantation. So the blue bars are living donors, which are the vast majority, and the green and red bars are deceased donors. They differentiate between heart death and brain death, which is something I can clarify for you a little bit later. For our purposes, it's not that important. But what I mainly want to say here is that living donation, let me just go back for one more second. Transplantation in Japan mainly means living donor transplantation. And there are a number of reasons for that. And again, I don't want to dwell too long on this, but as transplantation became mainstream form of clinical therapy in the United States in the 1970s and really 1980s, Japan also began to have these kinds of conversations. It turned out to be a very thorny and sticky set of conversations in Japan. And that set of conversations, again, it's something we could spend a lot more time on, really revolved on around questions of brain death and whether brain death can be equated with human death. In order for organs to be removed or procured from a deceased body, the organs need to remain perfused with blood and oxygen. That means that the body has only recently deceased. And there were all kinds of very interesting and rich ethical questions that became the subject of very lively dispute, I would say particularly in Japan, about whether brain death can be equated with human death, also what it means to desecrate the body so recently after death. And Margaret Locke in particular is somebody who really drew on the Japanese discussion in order to kind of highlight some of the issues around the concept of brain death, and then this massive kind of industry of deceased donor transplantation that it made possible. And she really kind of hones in on the question of how comfortable are we imagining the deceased body as a container for organs that will then be transplanted into someone else's body to give life. And Locke, in the very beginning of the book, has this little snippet from, she for many years taught at McGill University in Montreal. She included this little image from the Montreal Gazette, probably in her morning paper when she woke up. And I think it kind of captures some of her critique of the problem of deceased donor transplantation, which is that many people talk about deceased donor transplantation or deceased donation as a way of giving meaning to or making sense of tragic loss. So she has this image of a car accident. And, if you look at a lot of the language on transplantation program websites or the United Organ Sharing Network, you will often see this language of, one body can give life to 8 lives or something like that. And Locke is really objecting to the kind of utilitarian message here that that organs can be sort of regenerated and give life to new bodies and worrying about the fact that in doing so, we're diminishing the dignity of the life that they came from. So that is really one of the cruxes of the issue in Japan. I think, I want to say that to this day, even though there have been a number of disputes and debates in Japan about whether they should move forward with deceased donor transplantation, finally in 1997, there was an organ transplant law that was passed. However, to this day, the number of deceased donations in Japan remains very small, and I usually check it every year. The highest it's been since the 1997 law was passed was 97. It dipped a little bit during COVID, and then 2022, which is the most recent data that's available, there were 93 deceased donors. So fewer than 100 deceased donors in Japan every year is a very small number. So kidney donation in Japan means living donation. And transplantation in Japan means living donor transplantation. And so the organs that tend to get transplanted are organs which can be transplanted from living donors, which is mainly kidneys and livers. So what I wanted to do, at the risk of having told a bit of a shaggy dog story, what I want to focus on today is the question of living donation. And the reason that living donation is more compelling and more acceptable in Japan is sort of historically the reason that for many, living donation is kind of the antithesis of this sort of commodified nature of deceased donation. With deceased donation, the body is giving to anonymous recipients. There's the risk of the dehumanization of the donor, and the focus on new life as opposed to focusing on the tragedy of the old life. In contrast, living donation is meant to be less commodified and more intimate. It's an expression of emotional connection, love, sacrifice, a gift, that which requires no reciprocity, an act divorced from exchange or market logic. And anthropologist and Charlotte Eichels, who's present today, has written a wonderful kind of review article of some of this literature. Anthropologists have been really fascinated by this language of the gift. It's a very important language that makes the industry of organ transplantation possible and embraceable, because again, it differentiates the idea of an emotional gift that's presented without ties from something that could be likened to a commodity where there's an expectation of reciprocity and perhaps then a slippery slope to something that becomes more marketizable or alienable from the body, just the organs as kind of free-floating entities that can demand their own price. And we all know where that might lead to the sort of dark world of human trafficking and so forth. So the Japan Society for Transplantation has been very conservative about this. And they state that in order to sort of contain this fear of kind of marketization, they have restricted living donation only to kin. And they require that the donors be within 6 degrees of separation from the recipients. It's a fairly conservative set of regulations, although outside of the United States, many countries that mainly do living donation, it is mostly kin who donate to other kin. And indeed, the very first successful living donor kidney transplantation in the world, which was conducted here in Boston at what was then the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, now Brigham and Women's Hospital, was conducted in 1954. And the donation occurred between 2 identical twins, Richard and Ronald Herrick. And there were biological reasons why it would make sense to transplant between 2 identical twins, of course, because of a tissue and blood match between donor and recipient. But there were also social reasons. And the Massachusetts legal opinion that permitted the transplant to move forward reasoned that the twins were likely so close, quote, emotionally, as well as in every other way, that the loss of a kidney by the donor would be less devastating in the holistic sense than the loss of an identical twin sibling. So you see this kind of powerful language of emotional connection. I want to explore this language now in the context of Japan and kind of explore the apparatus that I think makes living donation possible and acceptable in the context of Japan, which to me is very much echoing a kind of broader logic of distribution of resources, social welfare, and even coming to some of Mary Brinton's language, the transmission of human capital. These are some of the places where I collect my data each year, and now you get treated to some of my little homemade pie charts. So as you can see from this chart, which is taken from data from Nihon Ishoku Gakkai and Nihon Rinsho Jin Ishoku Gakkai, there are 2 categories of relationship of donor to recipient that occupy, the biggest chunks of this pie, and those are parent and spouse. And I want to talk a little bit about each. I want to explore how the logic of kin donation is consistent with cultural ideologies of kinship and social welfare. I also want to explore some of the costs of limiting organ donation to kin only, and explore the ways in which, with respect to spousal donation, limiting donation to kin only can actually require more aggressive biological intervention because they're not biologically matching. But let me first start by talking about parents, because it's only within the past 4 or 5 years that spouses have become the biggest part of this pie. The gift from a parent, and it's usually the mother, surprisingly, is the easiest one to naturalize as purely altruistic. A gift from a parent to child appears antithetical to the commodity form, motivated by true feelings, as one endocrinologist put it to me at the hospital where I've been conducting research for the past several years, just outside of Tokyo. From my perspective, women do have the motherly instinct to give to their child, and that will never change. Informational videos which educate families about the possibility of living donation also use the case of a mother giving to a child as the archetypal and presumably most emotionally compelling form of living donor kidney transplantation. See if I have a slide of the hospital where I was sitting. Yes. This just gives you a sense. Kind of looks like your basic public hospital in Japan. I've spent many weeks here talking with transplant surgeons, kidney recipients, kidney donors, including recipients from deceased donors, couples who've given to one another, also organ transplant coordinators, nurses, educators, and others. So in the summer of 2016, I sat in one of the conference rooms in this hospital with the shades pulled closed, speaking with Ito Junko, a pseudonym, a 70-year-old woman who had donated a kidney to her son 6 years before, when she was the age of 65. She was visiting the hospital for a checkup. Ito-san told me that she had given her left kidney, she pointed to me, when her son was 34. He suffered from diabetes. Diabetes causes 40% of end-stage renal disease in Japan, which had culminated in ESRD. For 1.5 years, 1.5 years, he had undergone dialysis, which she described as excruciating. When asked how the family decided who would donate the kidney, she first explained that the hospital had tested everything and that it was decided that she was the best fit. She then explained that her husband was still working and that it was really for that reason that they'd made the decision. It was a pretty basic way of thinking, tanjun na kangai kata. Ito-san recounted, we had a meeting with the coordinator and the doctor to review the possibilities, but I knew that I'd like to be the one to give even before that. Ano ko ni ageru, I thought. I had already decided. Ito-san had no qualms, no second thoughts, no mayoi, she told me. When she and her husband were collecting information about the possibility of transplantation, they had seen a video of a family about a mother who had donated a kidney to her daughter. That daughter was the same age as her son. She told me, I was touched by the fact that a mother's kidney freed her daughter from the agony of toseki. Okasan no jinzo de toseki no tsurasa kara kaihou sareta. The notion of transfer from one family member to another, specifically from mother to child, fits with ideals of gender, family, and social welfare in Japan, in which intergenerational transmission of resources is assumed and parents invest in the human capital of their children. And again, I think Mary's work, particularly her early work, has talked about this better than most of the literature that we have available. The gift of a kidney makes sense in the context of these material conditions. It is a transfer that perpetuates the family line and facilitates upward mobility. Of the 4 people I interviewed who were either mothers who had given kidneys to children or had received kidneys from a mother, all mothers who had donated to a son cited the son's future chances of financial stability and marriageability as a reason for donating. Also, a daughter's marriageability and fertility, which can be compromised by dialysis, are also cited as reasons for donation. If both parents are eligible, a mother is more likely. Now, just briefly, because the time is so succinct, I want to say that although this kind of donation from mother to child has a certain kind of cultural logic in Japan, it is not without kind of ethical and social issues, right? One thing that Ito-san told me through the course of the conversation is that she herself had diabetes and had to go on insulin treatment in order to do the transplant. She was also overweight. Hospitals in general, not just in Japan, but elsewhere, but I think they're stricter in Japan, believe that there are more surgical complications with a patient who has a higher body mass index. So she was asked to gradually lose weight before she could make the transplant. And also from the conversation, we've already seen that the model of the gift is a little problematic in the sense that there are monetary implications here, right? Of course, she's giving to her son because she says she wants to, but there are all kinds of other considerations that have to do with the family's economic and social stability. So there are kind of interesting frictions and tensions in this model of the gift, which is something anthropologists have historically paid a great deal of attention to. Now, I want to sort of stick with this idea of kind of interesting frictions and tensions as I navigate over to thinking about this large blue, navy blue section of the pie chart, which is the issue of spousal donors. And this is kind of my last big section, so hoping to end at 12:35.
No.
Okay, all right. One thing I just very briefly want to mention is that I think something that could be interesting to talk about perhaps in the discussion is that one of the things I learned in talking to donors, recipients, patients of all kinds, and also healthcare professionals, is that in Japan, parents give, as you can see from this chart, parents give to children. That's one of the biggest sectors of donors. Children do not give to parents. And I think that's a really interesting kind of set of issues here that demonstrates the way social welfare works in Japan. In some ways, I think it even says something interesting about filial piety, what it is and what it is not. Resources move down. They don't necessarily move back up, except perhaps in the form of care. But I was told by everyone I spoke to that a child donating to a parent would be almost unthinkable. There's like 1% of the pie who has, and I'm guessing it's under extraordinary circumstances. The issue of spousal donation is also really interesting. In some sense, it does make sense in the context of the social welfare model. A woman marries into a family. She then becomes responsible for helping to perpetuate the family line. She's involved in sacrificing. And in fact, spouses are now the fastest growing category of living donor kidney transplantation in Japan. But what's really interesting about this category is that it may be socially logical, but it's not biologically logical. And what makes spousal donation possible in Japan is the biotechnical intervention of immunosuppression. And that in itself is a very interesting conversation here. Immunosuppression is kind of the holy grail. Conquering the immune system is kind of the holy grail of transplantation. And if you, again, think about the Japanese kinship model, one of the things that's striking here is that spouse is even bigger than sibling, right? So we might expect from a biological standpoint that siblings would be the most natural donors. But from a kinship standpoint, it made less sense. For example, a woman marries out of the family, technically, right? Marries, and her name is no longer on the toseki, joins another family, and her organs are kind of considered then beholden to the family that she marries into. Now, when I talk to people at the hospital waiting room, about why, did you ask your siblings, did you talk to your siblings about this? They didn't go into this long discussion about Japanese kinship, but they did say like, my brother has his life, or my sister has her life, or, I didn't think I could ask. That wasn't really a conversation. So one of the really striking aspects of this chart is that instead of siblings who would be more likely to be biologically compatible, we have spouses who are stepping up to donate, who in order to do so are undergoing in order to make that possible, recipients often have to undergo a tremendous amount of immunosuppression. Now, spouses are also kind of an interesting category in the sense that they become part of the family, but from the traditional notion of sort of the vertical model of Japanese kinship, of course, there are many varieties of, ie seido and so forth. They kind of are and are not part of the family. And so when I was speaking to women who'd either received a kidney from their husband, that happens sometimes, or more often donated a kidney to their husband, they kind of talked about this slight tension. Saito Kyoko, who received a kidney from her husband when she was 49, after she had become severely diabetic, told me the doctor suggested consulting with my spouse about making a donation. Her husband immediately said he would donate. However, she hesitated. She remarked, "He's an other to me, Tannin, and not related by blood, Muketsuen." So I didn't want to get it from him, and I felt a sense of resistance to the idea that inside of me would be my husband's kidney. 自分の中に主人の腎臓が入っていることにちょっと抵抗を感じた。Another woman whom I spoke with who told me a very long story, which was very moving actually, about how she donated to her husband, was, again, these are pseudonyms, Yanagi Haruko, a 53-year-old woman who quite recently donated a kidney to her husband. She told me how she came to imagine herself as a donor, that the idea was not immediately natural or compelling to her. She had the surgery to remove her kidney 8 months before I interviewed her. When the medical care team informed her that the transplant was a possibility, when they first began discussing it with the surgeon and so forth, they were told, "Ishoku wa kano desu." That means she's eligible to donate. She told me, "I was surprised and a little disappointed. Gachito shita." I had assumed that they would need a strong match, as with a mother and a child. So I want to just now move to my last slide to kind of think about, these issues of immunosuppression and donation. There's a way in which I could have just started with this slide, but maybe this will take us into some conversation later because there's a lot here. Again, you can see these are kind of homemade in the sense that one eye is floating slightly higher than the other, but it gives you a sense of my little cottage industry making these. So on the left, we have living donor transplant by donor relation in Japan. That's a slide we've been looking at. And on the right, we have the United States. Now, I just want to call your attention to a couple of things here as we wrap up. One is on the United States side, if you look at the left side of the pie, I have to turn around actually because I'm nearsighted. You'll see 3 categories which say non-biological directed, non-biological anonymous, and non-biological unrelated paired donation. Essentially, what this is first telling us is that about half of the pie on the US side are non-biological donations. Now, the reason this has become the case in Japan is precisely for the reason that matching the donor and recipient is viewed to be a good thing from a medical standpoint. I've actually kind of geeked out on a lot of this data and learned that at least from what I understand now, I don't think Japan is compromising its transplant outcomes by relying heavily on non-compatible. I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Okay, the reason why we have this large section of the pie on the left is that actually American clinics are questing after better biological matches. And so the definition of paired donation, the gray section, is when a hospital will help you if you and your husband or you and your donor are not a biological, a blood or tissue match. They will match you with, I think I have, sorry, this will help there. This is called kidney paired donation. And so basically it's a swap. So, if I want to give a kidney to David, because as you said, we're old friends, that is not something I could do in Japan, but I could do it in the United States as long as I'm willing to demonstrate that David hasn't been coercing me or paying me behind the scenes. But I'm type A, I'm actually A negative. And what type are you?
O.
OC? It wouldn't work. O is universal donor, but O can only receive from O. So in that case, what a hospital would prefer to do is to enter you into one of these kidney chains, find another couple where I could give to that recipient, and the donor and the other couple who hopefully has type O will then give to David. Okay, so what's interesting about, just very quickly, what's interesting about this left side is that basically the idea of bringing in non-biological donors is to find a better match, and undergoing immunosuppression in order to receive a kidney from a non-matching donor is a considerably arduous procedure. It involves extracorporeal blood filtration, very toxic immunosuppressive drugs, et cetera. The other categories are non-biological directed. That would mean that it's a directed donation and that David knows me, he knows the donor, but it's not biological kin. So that could be a friend, it could be a colleague, it could be somebody who cares about you, who's willing to donate. And then the middle category is what are called altruistic donors or anonymous donors who just give. They don't know who they're giving to. They don't have a partner who needs an organ. They give out of some kind of sense of obligation. It's actually a very interesting phenomenon in and of itself. The main point of looking at this, though, is just to, in a way, to reflect back on Japan and to think about what a considerable degree of pressure is being placed on kin donors in Japan, precisely because they don't have these non-biological, non-kin donors. And I think I really want to kind of close on that note. That the welfare model in some ways contains the possibility of Japanese healthcare providers worry about is kind of the commodification of the body. But it also places a very great burden on families themselves. This is just some little immune suppression data, but let me skip to here. There's a few things we can say about organ transplantation in Japan and the fact that it really is a kind of fundamentally different kind of social intervention from what we see in the United States, that organs move from older to younger, not younger to older. In fact, in the United States, the largest growing category is middle-aged children giving to their 70-plus-year-old parents. It moves from parent to child, not child to parent. Transplant is not being used to extend the life of those over age 65 in Japan, whereas it is in the United States. The social ideal of resource transmission is more important than biological match, even if the recipient has to pay a kind of taxing price of undergoing immunosuppressive therapy. Donor average age is higher, whereas recipient average age is lower in Japan. So it really is more of a life-saving treatment rather than a life-extending treatment. Organs come from family members, not anonymous strangers, and interestingly, non-biological spouses over biological siblings. Spousal donations are expanding kidney donation in Japan. And again, something we can come back to, but this idea of sort of containing the logic of exchange between anonymous donor and recipient, containing a market-oriented transaction and instead creating a kind of transmission of resources within the family based on a social welfare model. I think there's more we could talk about, and I have more material in case questions come up, but I'd like to stop there and hear everyone's thoughts.
Great, thank you so much. So as I mentioned at the outset, I'll turn now to Masami Fujioka, who is an official at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, in Japan, where he works on healthcare policy. He's working on a research project entitled Creating the Health Tech Startup Ecosystem Policy Innovations for Entrepreneurship. And so, please.
Yeah, thank you. So, Professor Ami, thank you for great presentation. So, my name is Masami, and I Mr. Yoga and Mr. Yoga House in Japan. So, and I have expressed my willingness to donate all of my products.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm proud to be at the last question first.
That's unusual in the context of Japan. Yeah.
So my first question is about financial compensation, not incentive, just compensation
Okay.
for organ donors. So living kindly donation, kidney donation in family can improve the quality of life for both the donor and the patient, because Toseki is a great ban on the whole family. But people don't always make fully rational decision. So some donor might feel negative emotion if it is to improve on life. So I think that exchange donor between multiple families, you said, is a wonderful solution, and that also create ethical issue. And but I think that we need to take another step forward. So I understand there are ethical concerns, but I believe that providing better financial compensation, of course, within certain rules, preventing unfair decision making and organ trafficking, yeah, could be important. What do you think about this? Yeah, okay. I have one.
Should I, just one question? Okay. I was wondering if I should hear your next question so I could pace myself. Okay, yeah, that's, you're not the first person to ask that question. And many people ask that question around the world. As far as I know, and my information could be a little dated, so someone can correct me, there is actually only one country that has a kind of regulated organ market, as you're suggesting. So not something where people make deals on the sides, however much they can pay to incentivize, but rather to compensate in a regulated manner, and that is Iran. And it's been proposed many times by many people in the United States that we have that here, because it would help so many people. As you point out, I mean, dialysis is a really arduous way to live. And, from a resource standpoint, on many levels, kidney transplantation makes a lot of sense. It's even, I think, more cost effective. I'm not sure I've completely gotten to the bottom of that, but dialysis is very expensive. It's free for all Americans who need dialysis through Medicare, and it's also free, almost free or pretty close in Japan. So it's very expensive in terms of healthcare subsidies for the Japanese government. It's just that I don't think I have a particularly sophisticated answer to your question beyond just the kind of basic sort of default reply, which is that as far as I'm concerned, nobody's ever been able to answer the question of how do you deal with the fact that the people who would be selling their kidneys might not be, is there a fine line between a coercive and a non-coercive decision to sell your kidneys? In other words, could you view economic disadvantage as a form of coercion that's impelling some people to sell where others don't have to? And so there's a kind of thorny social equality issue there to creating a market. And my sense, and maybe perhaps something that you could shed light on if we have a chance to chat afterwards, is that they're just very conservative about those kind of fears. There have been some instances in Japan, I have a slide, but of middlemen stepping in, saying, somebody appears and says, I'm this person's younger sister and I want to give, and they're not that person's younger sister, and they're selling, and they just very conservative about that kind of thing. But I've never totally been clear why. And even the fact that they restricted to just kin is kind of an interesting sort of slightly more conservative stance. And I'm not sure I've totally gotten to the bottom of why that either. So there's something in Japan there that that kind of conservative stance that I'm not sure I've totally permeated. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. So I'll open things up to the floor, and also we have an audience watching on Zoom. So if you're in our Zoom audience and you'd like to ask a question, just please enter the question into the chat, and if there's time, I'll read the question aloud on your behalf.
Does this still work?
Yeah, we can make that.
Okay, so the floor is open.
I'll be short in my responses.
We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Yes, Joel.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, and if you could identify yourself.
Oh yes, I'm Joel Lang, a postdoctoral fellow at the White Shack Institute. Nice to meet you. Yeah, to start with, I had this horrible image of people giving their weird uncles kidneys because they had a drinking problem, and I was glad that turned out not to be the case. But is there a sense of often, I actually don't know the numbers or anything, but kidney problems can be associated with lifestyle. And is there a sense of why am I doing this for my son or daughter because they have made all these bad decisions and now I'm the one having to give them a kidney? Is this something that ever comes up, or is this something that people would rather not talk about?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. There are countries like Singapore where those are qualifications for receiving an organ. You have to have a healthy lifestyle. And, if you're, the United Organ,
United Network.
Thank you. United Network for Organ Sharing also ask those kinds of questions. They have, very utilitarian calculations about how long the kidney will continue to perform in the new recipient's body. In Japan, and also there is a rule in Japan and perhaps elsewhere as well that you can't be a smoking recipient of a kidney, or you have to undergo smoking cessation therapy. With respect to alcohol, it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart because alcohol is very tolerated in Japan. Even being a heavy drinker is not necessarily considered unhealthy or unusual or a social problem. And I did hear stories from women who said that their husbands were heavy drinkers, or that they just drowned everything in soy sauce or whatever it was. They loved Coke. And they would sort of mention it, but nobody, I think that these things have a lot of, it's a lot of sort of fungibility. Nobody really said, and therefore I objected. And also because drinking is kind of acceptable. And even with smoking, I was told that the requirement is to stop smoking, but you can start smoking again. And you can also kind of stop for a week or two before you go in for your test. And so you can fudge it a little bit. So my sense is that at least in Japan, it's fairly permissive, and that would be consistent with cultural norms. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mimi Kondo. I study at Harvard School of Design, and I did a project on cemeteries and studied internment methods last year. So I want to ask you a question about, so Japan has a considerably low percentage of people giving consent to organ donations after their death compared to other countries. And as a Japanese person myself, I understand sort of the cultural reluctance towards the commodification of the body. And I would like to hear your opinions on why do you think this is prominent in Japan and not as prominent in the US and other countries? And in other words, what makes Japan so specifically different?
Yeah, I wonder if I could just project, that's Helen Hardacre, who's also sitting here, has written an incredible essay which kind of reviews some of those debates that occurred in Japan in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s about whether they should pass an organ transplant law. There are all kinds of really interesting questions there. I don't think there's one answer. As a very brief way to engage your question, I would say that a lot of attention, and Helen, I think you pointed out in your essay as well, a lot of attention has been paid to kind of cultural factors and to a much more limited extent, religious factors. There may be, Margaret Locke, for example, her book that I projected early on in the presentation focuses a lot on issues of otsuya. So if the organs are removed, the notion of gotai manzoku, that if organs are removed, the body might not be able to peacefully make its way into the next world, or shijuku nichi, that it's not until 49 days after death that the body is interred, and the belief is that within the shijuku nichi, the person gradually makes their way. So what would it mean to remove the organs immediately at the moment of death? I mean, the book is a very profound, I think, reflection on cultural questions that make that complicated in Japan. And, how do we disentangle the biological person from the social person is really the question that she's asking. But I also think, two more very brief points. I also think that there may be issues, her book was published in the early 2000s. I think there might be other things, Helen, you may be able to chime in, that we could talk about now, even just, for example, infrastructural issues or financial incentives of Japanese healthcare. I don't think the Japanese healthcare system is incentivized to perform as many surgeries. Transplantation is very lucrative surgery in the United States. When I last visited the hospital where I've been conducting research, they weren't doing transplant anymore. It had moved to a different hospital. And I asked why, and they said they lost their anesthesiologist. And I thought, my gosh, this place is going to fold. But they didn't seem that worried about it. They just, had like a hijokin kind of guy who would come in, and they did, the basic surgeries they needed to do. And it wasn't a huge loss of revenue for them. So doing organ transplantation is really complicated. You have to have a trauma unit, and sometimes you need like a helicopter pad so that organs can be flown in, and it's a whole thing. So I think there might be some more sort of rudimentary questions that they just haven't done that. And I would also just say, if I can find this without taking too much, oops, sorry, no, I'm hitting the wrong. That it's tempting to think that Japan is unique, but it's not so unique. It's really one of these stories where, sorry, blah, blah, blah. I should go to the, I prepared, oops, it's not going anymore. Shoot. Try it again. Oh. My gosh. Yeah. So Japan is at one end of the spectrum, but the countries that perform the most organ transplantation, where it's really become like a mainstream form of medical therapy, are actually concentrated in the Western world. And a lot of Asian countries don't look so different from Japan. These are deceased donor transplants. These are heart transplants, but it's kind of an index. And you see that like heart transplantation is kind of the, I don't know, it's like the heavy duty stuff. And you see that it's mainly, Europe and North American countries that are performing this surgery. So I think we might be tempted to exceptionalize Japan in ways that we probably shouldn't. And my presentation would have also in some ways contributed to that, but we need to be careful. Yeah.
Helen.
Helen Hardacre, Department of East Asian Languages. Amy, I so enjoyed this presentation, and I'm afraid I don't have any information on the infrastructural questions that you were asking about. But one thing that strikes me as an area of the overall culture around organ transplantation that I really don't know anything about for Japan would be whether in the broader cultural context, as in this country or in Western Europe as well, we find all sorts of films, novels, fantasies really about organ transplant and the things that can go wrong. So there's this film, I'm sure you've seen, Dirty Pretty Things, where there is an immigrant doctor from, I think, Nigeria, who was forced into performing kidney removal on people who are being coerced into it or who are doing it for economic survival, or the stories you occasionally see about transplants in countries that the United States say has a problematic relationship with, China, North Korea, and so on. Rumors that transplants are being taken, organs are being taken from people who are incarcerated, or fantasies about having a child in order to have that child be a source of an organ that somebody else needs, that kind of thing. Do we see that kind of cultural fantasizing around organ transplant in Japan? And if not, is it just because the practice is fairly small scale, or What do you think?
That's interesting. I have to say that I should steep myself more in the, I've kind of been wonking out with these charts and graphs, and I should steep myself more in the popular culture, because my sense is that there is quite a bit. You know, just because people will share things with me, or occasionally I'll come across something. I haven't heard so much about that, and I think your intuition may be right, that, you know, because they don't do as much, they don't have these sort of dystopic imaginaries around it. But you do hear, I mean, the things that I hear about are things that do happen. So for example, like a lot of Japanese, well, I should refresh my memory about the numbers, but the number of Japanese transplant tourists is not small. Which is another kind of interesting sort of negative burden that's associated with just keeping it to kin. You know, it's very pure in its way, but then the side effect is that people actually are, you know, will go to Kazakhstan, China, Egypt, trying to remember the other hotspots, Philippines. So that's one thing. And, you know, there's been a lot of exposés that do occupy the popular imagination, not exposé, I mean, muckraking about real things that are happening. And the other is that a lot of children will travel abroad to get transplantation. There's a lot of kind of websites, and, you know, this is even more in contrast with something dystopic. It's actually more like heart tugging, kind of celebratory, like this child traveled to America and was able to receive a transplantation and that kind of thing. Those are the kinds of narratives I'm more familiar with. I need to look more into it. I like your question.
I'm Nagisa Osaki. I'm an associate of the program on US Foundations. Your presentation was very interesting for me. And I'd like to ask you about, like, in the future, with the advancement of regenerative medicine, such as kidney transplant or artificial organs, do you think these new medical treatments could be accepted in Japanese society or could be controversial?
That's something I really want to look into, and I have started. I mean, the question that people often pose about Japan, not just in this context, but other contexts, is like, why are they so behind? Why aren't they doing this? You know, Japan has a very sophisticated biomedical healthcare system. They could be performing organ transplants if they wanted to, but they've made these social decisions, or the infrastructure hasn't quite caught up, or whatever. But I think an interesting counter question to that could be like, do they need to? Because organ transplantation is a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, it is a bit grotesque and sad to think about it. And I think a lot of surgeons themselves and healthcare providers think that, or hope that, it will be a temporary phase in the science of biotechnology, and that eventually we will be able to synthesize human tissue so that we don't have to rely on other humans to provide and replace organs, with all the ethical encumbrances. And, you know, maybe Japan will just kind of skip that phase. You know, by the time they build the helicopter pads and all that, maybe we'll be doing something else. And as you pointed out, there are a number of interesting directions. One is xenotransplantation, particularly from animals, specifically pigs usually, which is something that's undergoing a lot of experimentation in the United States. Some of you probably followed the news that I think it was a few months ago, a recipient received a heart from a pig. They subsequently passed away. But what's really interesting is that what I understand is exciting in Japan right now, this research is going on, and it's all being done through induced pluripotent stem cells, iPS-SIBO, which is a very Japanese thing that was developed by the Nobel laureate Yamanaka Shinya. And University of Kyoto is a hub for this experimentation of synthesizing kidney and liver tissue with iPS-SIBO. It's a way of kind of getting around a lot of the controversy of stem cell donation and stem cell synthesis, because that invokes issues of, you know, regenerating human life and that kind of thing. So they're looking, there's a lot of interest in iPS-SIBO in Japan. And I want to visit University of Kyoto. I'm hoping to do that next time I go to Japan in February. But, you know, perhaps that will generate solutions that in the end never necessitate Japan having to march down this kind of, in a way, sort of gruesome and ethically complicated path of deceased and living organ donation and transplantation. Yeah.
We're right at 1 o'clock now, and so I'll have to call this to a close. I'm sure there are other questions. I have some questions of my own, but anyway, please join me in thanking.